Okay, we're in the midst of our discussion of life as defiance, and I have a couple of vignettes that may appear as a little bit as tangents, but they're really not. We just finished talking about the return to equilibrium or the dynamics of relaxation to equilibrium for a system that's perturbed away from the state of equilibrium, and I showed you this whole collection of laws which were written in the form of something like j was equal to, well, let me not make it vectorial for the time being. J is equal to minus some constant k and then times some driving force. Okay, and the driving force was degree of disequilibrium. And what I'm claiming is that those were all phenomenological. So let me be precise, at least semi-precise, about what I mean by phenomenological. What I mean by that is that one goes out in the world, one observes, one makes some measurements, and then on the basis of that, there's a there's a quantitative statement of our experience. In other words, we looked a bunch of times, and we found that every time that we looked, that the behavior satisfied a certain simple relationship, such as the one that I just wrote down. Let me give you another familiar example. This is one of my favorite pictures, and you'll probably already recognize, if not already in the course, then at least by the time we're done, you'll recognize my obsession with, in general, anytime work is done to a system, I want to be able to represent it by loading devices like weights. And this is taken at a museum in Paris called Art and Métier, which is a place where you can see all of Lavoisier's equipment that he used when he was working out things like the gas laws. And there's a name for this collection of scientists known as the pneumochemists, like pneumatic, pneumo, the pneumochemists. And the reason that they're well known, among other things, is the ones who figured out the gas laws, but also they figured out the stoichiometric equation for photosynthesis. Which, if you stop and think about it, how do you do that 300 years ago, 250 years ago? And what I found amusing is that they would use little bottles, a bit like the ones you might see an Austrian hiker going to the mountains with some wine. It's a leather pouch, basically. So, at any rate, what is the point of the picture? Well, this is the device used by Gay-Lussac on the track of the series of relationships between, empirical relationships, I guess is the way I want to say it. Very important. Empirical relationships. And it's between key quantities such as the pressure, the volume, and the temperature. And there's a whole suite of laws. I can't remember which names go with which one, but there's Boyle's law is one of them, and then there's one named after Charles, and then there's Gay-Lussac. And when all the dust settles, they're all different contributions in the end to what we now know as the ideal gas law, which I can write either as PV equals little nr or capital NKBT. So that is a phenomenological law. Sure, later on you might, by some sort of microscopic reasoning, be able to justify this. And in fact, already in the 1700s, Daniel Bernoulli, using a molecular interpretation of pressure and collisions with walls and stuff, was able to figure out a relationship between pressure and temperature. Maybe I don't remember anymore, but I think those were the two variables of interest that he was able to connect. That's fine, but that does not take away from the phenomenological law. The title of this vignette is phenomenological. It's not a dirty word, and in physics, of course, it's not a dirty word. But in biology, it is a bit of a dirty word, and I say no to that. And the reason I say no is that there's great power in taking our experience of the world and our measurements about the world and compactly summarizing it in the form of some quantitative relationship, which may only hold under a limited regime. That's fine. And in fact, sometimes what I would say is that there's a lot of emphasis these days on doing fits to data. Well, what do you think that is? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to replace the data with some sort of a functional form, then that's some sort of a phenomenological relationship. I give those often less credit because there's no implication, hey, this seems like it's a general statement about a suite of different circumstances, and I can use it for all of them. In the case of the ideal gas law, you really have the sense, okay, if the density's not too high and so on, I ought to be able to get away with using it in a bunch of different contexts. So here, I'm just pointing out that, we already talked in detail about the diffusion equation, and we're going to talk about Navier-Stokes for fluid mechanics. But these two equations, this one and this one, are two of the biggest equations for describing the natural world that we have. The diffusion equation is our reflections on the way that mass gets moved around, and the Navier-Stokes equations are a way of characterizing the fluid flow, and in particular trying to figure out the velocity and the pressure as a function of space and time. Super important. And both of them hinge on simple phenomenological laws, if you will. In this case, it's Fick's law, which we've already talked about a bunch of times. And in this case, it's Newtonian law of viscosity, which tells us that the shear stress is proportional to the gradient in the velocity. As you can see that in this little diagram. Why am I telling you this? I'm just trying to make a plug for the importance of such laws. If you work at Boeing Aircraft Company and you want to try to simulate the nature of flow over a wing and turbulence and lift and stuff like that, believe me, it's not going to be based on molecules. It's going to be based on these kinds of things. Continuing down this path, here's another example. We have a whole suite of relationships, all of which are examples of sort of generalized Hooke's law. And so on the left-hand side, I show you the most common one, the one that you probably learned about in freshman physics or something, that tells us that there is a linear relationship between force and displacement from equilibrium. So think about a mass spring system. The beauty of that is that same kind of thinking can be applied in all sorts of other different contexts. In the last vignette, I already mentioned that beam bending, we can take a beam and there will be a cost to that, which goes like 1 over the radius of curvature squared, so it's a curvature energy. So that's basically a quadratic law that tells us that there's a quadratic relationship between departure from equilibrium and the force, or in this case, the energy. So it's a linear relationship between force and departure, quadratic relationship between energy and the departure from equilibrium. You can see here that there's a corresponding thing for membrane bending. So in this case, the bending of a membrane, we're going to be interested in how much energy does it cost. And once again, it's quadratic in the departure. And then finally, if I have a cell that swells, for example, then there's going to be a quadratic cost in the swelling volume change. So all of these are phenomenological. They reflect the underlying mechanisms about springiness of molecules, but clearly the springiness of a covalently bonded solid and the springiness of rubber and the springiness of a lipid bilayer membrane are not going to have the same mechanistic underpinnings. And actually that's important, that's deep. In other words, I would say to the mechanists, hold on a second, you're missing something by obsessing on the molecular details of a lipid bilayer, because you're basically depriving yourself of the opportunity to see the sameness between a lipid bilayer on the one hand, a piece of rubber on the other, and a piece of steel on the other. They're all the same fundamentally in the sense that it's a quadratic energy as a function of departure from equilibrium, where there's a linear relationship between the restoring force and the degree of departure from equilibrium. Now, just to get a little bit more biological, although already the Hooke's law and the Navier-Stokes are completely biologically relevant, but here, I'm just saying that there are discoveries being made. So the middle one, for example, there's a really cool paper by Rebecca Heald and Dan Fletcher's labs having to do with the scaling of the spindle as a function of the volume within which the spindle forms. The lower left, Wallace Marshall and his group have been thinking about the scaling of mitochondrial size as a function of cell size. For me, these are empirical, phenomenological relationships. The mantra of the course, or one of them, is that quantitative data demands quantitative models. I would like to try to understand these phenomenological relationships, but let's just take the case of the mitochondria. Perhaps, I don't know this, perhaps it will depend upon something about fission and fusion proteins. The particular details of this or that fission or fusion protein, to my mind, I'm making a speculation, will not be the relevant insight. The relevant insight will be some sort of a law having to do with birth-death processes and that sort of thing. The last example I wanted to give is one that we've already talked about a little bit, and that has to do with really interesting work from people like Terry Hua and many of the people that have worked with him, having to do with the proteome. And here the idea is, sure, the proteome, for me, for E. coli, the proteome includes 4,500 different players. And what they're claiming is that I can think of the proteome as sort of these pie charts on the right, where there's certain subcategories of proteins, and all I really want to do is keep track phenomenologically of the relative proportions of those different bits. What's shown on the left-hand side is how the ribosomal content goes up with growth rate, and then it also, the colored curves tell you something about what happens to ribosomal content in the context of antibiotics. That's not my point. My main point is really about the pie charts and the notion of a phenomenological growth law, where one would say, I'm not going to consider the details of gene expression. I'm not going to write down like I did. I wrote down all these equations for molecular switches, for switches, mutual repression switches, for negative autoregulation, for positive autoregulation, for oscillators, this, that, and the other. And what one's saying is like, okay, that's cool. And if you want to go pursue that, which my lab has done, that's fine. But maybe if you're really interested in what makes the cell tick, it will be more powerful and more useful to think about it from the point of view of this higher level phenomenological law. And so just to summarize, I mean, I'm done. It is a bit of a rant, and it's a rant that I'm more calm than I actually feel, because I feel very strongly about this, because the notion of mechanism, in my opinion, is so abused often. It's become a synonym for did you do your microscopics? And when I think about the patterns of clouds that I see out an airplane window, or when I think about the bridge that collapsed under oscillations, I would never in a million years mechanistically think about any of those things on the basis of microscopics. And if I'm being sarcastic or if I'm being a little bit nasty, I would just say to those that tell me, you need to know about the structure of the protein, I would, just sarcastically say, well, why should I listen to that? You didn't tell me about the quarks. I know that there are quarks inside, or you didn't tell me about those, so clearly you're not being mechanistic. Now, I say that tongue in cheek. I don't mean that seriously, because of course I know and believe and hope that one does not need to make reference to these smaller scales. So that's the whole point. And I'm just saying that one should generalize that attitude beyond the level of protein structures and so on when thinking about biological phenomena. So at any rate, the summary point is that phenomenological is not a dirty word. It's something to be proud of and to yearn for and to actually work for, and then to try to understand mechanistically if you want. But again, I practice the arts of elasticity and have been for 25 years, and almost never, even though I worked hard on it, almost never do I appeal to the microscopic underpinnings. It's much more powerful to just say, I have an elasticity theory and I'm going to use it to figure out things like the deformation of a piece of material, or what happens to a microtubule when it collides into a barrier, or whatever. I'm not going to focus on the underlying microscopic things. I'm going to replace all that microscopics with phenomenological parameters, such as this parameter kappa that you see on the screen right now.